GDPR was one of those changes to the way we looked at data. I mean, I think, if we talked earlier about me and my, opinion about the golden era of the early 2000s and that world. I think back in the 2000s, it was all about innovate. We've got this cool new tech and tools. Let's just push this as far as we possibly can go.
Welcome to another episode of the Mapscaping Podcast. My name is Daniel and this is a podcast for the geospatial community. My guest on the show today is Denise McKenzie. She's the co-director of the Benchmark Initiative, and today on the podcast we're going to be talking about location privacy. Today's podcast episode is sponsored by Landgrid.com. So this is your go-to resource for all things parcel data, property boundaries, ownership, land use, and all kinds of other property data covering the entire US. Yes, unfortunately, this service is only for the US at this stage, but I know one of the co-founders of this company, Jerry Paffendorf. He's actually been on the podcast before, and if you go back through the archives and have a look for polygons of ownership, you'll learn a lot more about what they do over there at Landgrid. And I know that these guys have plans on expanding. So this is a pretty amazing database. It's a pretty amazing resource they've built over there at Landgrid.com, and it's well worth checking out. Okay, let's get into the episode. Hi Denise, welcome to the podcast. I'm really pleased we could make this happen. There was a little bit of back and forth there, but we're both here now and I'm really looking forward to the conversation. So today we're going to be talking about location privacy, and this is a bit of a hot topic at the moment, so again, looking forward to this. And perhaps before we jump into the conversation, perhaps you could just give the listeners a brief overview of your background. How did you get involved in geospatial?
I think accident was probably the best description of how I got into geospatial. So, after doing a degree in public policy and politics, I kind of fell into it in the early 2000s when I worked for the public service in Melbourne, in Oz. Back then it was such an exciting time, I think, to be involved in the geospatial community. We were just at that changeover point where you're getting, geo out of GIS and onto the web. And you saw players like Google and Apple getting into the marketplace. But I was just really super lucky to get involved with some great innovation projects like the Spatial Smart Tag and the Victorian Mapping and Address Service that were really focused on taking the power, if you like, of geospatial and putting it into the hands of the non-technical people so that we can kind of make lots of better decisions. I guess from there, about 12 years of that work, I then did a rather insane thing of moving my entire family overseas. So I'm now based in the United Kingdom. And since then, I've done the outreach role at OGC, looking at open standards. I do the chair role with the Association for Geographic Information, passion areas like, women in geospatial and looking at diversity, and currently working on the Benchmark Initiative. So looking at location ethics.
Wow, so you have a real depth of history, I guess you could call it, in the geospatial world. Interesting to say that you thought it was a really exciting time back then in the early 2000s when you were just getting involved. Just as a side sort of question, do you still think it's an interesting time?
Do you know what? I think it is, but for a different reason. I think back then it was a little bit like, when you're in the first time you go to high school and you've got this, a bit, you're growing up. There's so much to learn and there's so much that you can become. And I think that early 2000s was really that for the geospatial community. I think kind of where we are now is almost like you're in your early 20s. We're now really being forced to be a lot more mature. We're being forced to really play with the adults now and be a really mature international foundation piece for our global decision making. So I think it's exciting, but for different reasons now. And I think that's why you're seeing topics like the ethics of what we do sort of raising its head at this point, and being a bigger, greater issue.
So I think this is an absolutely brilliant time to jump into the main topic of this podcast episode, and that is location privacy. You mentioned ethics there, and I'm pretty confident that that's going to come up later on in the conversation. But maybe we could start off by saying, why is location privacy important?
Location privacy. I think location privacy is currently such an important thing because, as we all, those of us that work in the geospatial space, geospatial data is really, really powerful. And particularly, I think in the last sort of 10 years since we've had mobile devices and mobile sensors on our body. Location data has gone from being something which is kind of about general groups. If it was about an individual, it was usually through a survey, etc. Whereas now it's real time. So location privacy is so important because now there is so much data out there that can identify me, and can identify my children or my husband or my grandmother, So I think that now privacy is being one of those things where people are uncomfortable about how much organizations know about them and how much other people can find out about them. And your location tells a lot about you as an individual. So it's become, I think, a fairly hot topic, particularly in the case of the last 6 months, looking at the issues of the pandemic and how governments have gone about trying to trace individuals, how they've said they are or are not going to deal with the data about that. And what it's shown is that, again, we're probably not that mature yet in understanding what the right ways are of handling that personal data in relation to your location.
Okay, so I completely agree with that. I think I'd put a few more words around it. So I would describe location data as becoming personal and incredibly granular. When I think about some of the tracking scenarios which you described there, I mean that this really does expose us. It makes us very easy to identify. But I'm wondering now, is that necessarily a bad thing all the time? Or is there also a lot of good that comes with that, at least that you can see?
That's a really good question. You're right in saying that there is great good that can be done with that granular data. I think the challenge that we've got with it is that there isn't yet good transparency from governments and organizations about how that granular data is going to be used, whether it's going to be exposed publicly, whether it's going to be, processed in such a way that it's no longer about an individual, but it shows a group because it's seen the patterns of the individuals. So I think whilst there's amazing good that we can do by having that granular data, and I don't want to scare people from sharing their data, what I think we're about on the Benchmark Initiative is trying to educate people a bit more about some of the risks that come with this, and to get people to want to find out more, to want to understand what an organisation is going to do with that data so that they know and they're confident that things that might identify them in a negative way are going to be, protected and not made public.
Haven't we already seen steps towards this? When I think about the General Data Protection Regulation, for example, here in the EU, and when I think about a lot of the conversations around data ethics, don't you think that sort of location data will just sort of fit naturally under that, and this kind of transparency that you were talking about will naturally happen anyway?
I'd love to say that was the case, but I'm not sure that is. I think, when you look at the data ethics conversation and the AI ethics conversation, et cetera, there's some really great charters out there and there's some great sets of principles that are there. And we're doing something similar with our Locus Charter that I'm sure we'll talk about in a bit. I think the challenge, though, you have with some of that conversation is that it's somewhat esoteric. It's so high level that it's really difficult for people who are practitioners, so the general everyday GIS user that's trying to do their project, how do they translate that set of principles into their everyday work to make sure that they're not going to do harm, to make sure that they're not going to do the wrong thing. So I think, in each one of the different data disciplines, whether you're looking at statistics, whether you're looking at geospatial or location data, it's really important actually that we look at our craft and look at our activities and then say, okay, well, what's the right behaviour for us to protect that privacy? What's the right set of skills I need to put in place, or the right set of measures and protections in that? Because I think it's through the practice that we make sure that we learn and that we make sure that we do the right thing.
Yeah, I completely agree. But in order to do that, we need some kind of guidelines, like a usable set of guidelines, as opposed to a massive amount of fine print that we don't really understand. And so we've used the word transparency before, or already in this conversation. And in a previous conversation, we talked a little bit about a transparency register. Perhaps you could walk us through the thinking behind that and how we as geospatial practitioners might use this.
That's awesome. I mean, to be fair, we haven't quite got to the geospatial register in practice yet. It's a concept that's been raised, but it's a really exciting one. So it was suggested to me from someone who works on a project in a developing country where they have a location data service that has gone through many, many cycles of change. You know, it started off with one purpose looking at flooding. It got then asked whether they could change it to start looking at fires. And with each time they had to go through that cycle, they made a new set of decisions. They made a new set of trade-offs, if you like, because, you know, data wasn't available to them, or the location information they were going to collect was going to make people's privacy be infringed. And so, but for them, they were like, we've made all these great decisions, but we don't have a really easy way or a consistent way to communicate that and to be transparent about what decisions we made and why we made them. And so that's where the idea of a transparency register was born, because they said, you know, what would be fantastic is if there was this sort of agreed standard or a template where for each one of those critical, you know, ethical type decisions that was made along the course of the project, you know, could they have a register where they could keep track of those? You know, and you mentioned in there the challenge of the fine print. You know, all of us have seen those great terms and conditions and things, and no one ever reads them, just clicks to get forward to the app. So the transparency register was also, I think, our idea or way of saying, well, can we get a much simpler format or communication tool for letting people know what we're doing, why we're doing it, and so we can do that communication and keep that transparency and trust open with what we're doing with people's location data.
I think that sounds like a brilliant sort of a set of first steps, if you will, being transparent about what we did, why we did it. And you talked about trade-offs in there. And I think that's a really interesting way of looking at it, because if we take, I think, a classic example of data privacy, if you look at a social media app, let's not mention any one in particular, but you think about social media in general, and I'm sure most people by now understand that this is a barter agreement that I'm entering into. I'm getting something of value from you, and you are getting something of value from me. So I am the product in this situation, but the value I'm getting from you is so great that I'm willing to make this trade-off. And I think the only thing that's sort of missing here is that real transparency around exactly what's happening. I think most of us have a broad understanding of how this sort of barter arrangement is working. We've seen it in practice for many years now. There have been some really interesting cases exposed in the media recently about this. But is this the kind of thing that we should be moving towards? Like a really clear understanding of what trade-offs we as practitioners are making and what trade-offs users are making when they enter into this agreement with us.
I couldn't agree more with everything that you've just said, Daniel. It's, you know, you have to realize now that data isn't just data, it's currency. And you as an individual with whatever device you are looking at, whether it's your mobile phone, whether it's, you know, the watch that's got a GPS in it that's tracking you around, all that data is valuable to somebody out there, whether it's someone who's looking after roads that wants to know where people are traveling, or the transport people, or the marketers that are there. So I think, you know, it's so critical at the moment that people recognize that it is a barter exchange. You know, this is a time where actually we are the currency, if you like, and we need to be careful with that. In the same way that you think carefully about where you invest your money and which shares and which bank and so forth, you should be being careful about where your data is going and who's using it for what reasons. You know, I think recently there's been some really great TV shows as well to go and look at. You know, The Social Dilemma illustrated for me just so well why you have to be careful, because, you know, this is personal stuff about you. And if people know a lot about you, then they can help to change your opinion. They can help to guide you towards buying their products. You know, so I think it's important that we become educated about this process.
Yeah, I agree. I think education is the key here. Transparency is the key, but doing it in such a way that we can understand it, that users can understand it. And when we think about geospatial practitioners, that they understand what they're doing in some sort of documentation seems to make really good sense here. I want to sort of emphasize that I think a lot of the times when we talk about these issues, when we talk about the issue of privacy, that we focus on the bad stuff, and which is fair enough. We focus on the things that we need to fix, but there's a lot of good coming out of these sort of barter arrangements that we're making with our data, because I think, as any good marketer knows, they can't solve a problem if they don't know what the problem is. And I'm wondering if you have any examples that you can think of where this barter arrangement, where this exchange of data has led to some really, really great outcomes.
So, I think currently one of the best examples I can give you is around looking at things like mobility data, and particularly as we as a global race come out of our lockdown space. We're having to do social distancing. That's an entirely new cultural way for us to deal with things, and how we get around, such as what transport we take and what methods and modes we choose, is really, really important. But at the moment, cities and transport authorities desperately need the data about who's accessing the different measures that they're putting in place. So take City of London, for example, has been had a program to look at micro-mobility, so rentable scooters and bikes and these sorts of things. What they really wanted to know as well is, what's really critical is to know that everybody has equal access to these options. And so to do that, you actually really want to get down into sensitive information like the race of the people who are accessing it, like the gender of the people who are accessing it, so that you can see whether any of them are missing from your data, and then try and work out why that is. So obviously that's really personal. And the only way to do that is to get people to opt in and share that information when they pick up that scooter, when they complete their journey, when they take that bike and ride it down the street. So, there is great good that can come from the sharing of that data. But that's also really personal about people. And you wouldn't want to necessarily make, for example, someone's ethnicity information publicly available. For as much as I'd love to say the world is very equal and nice about these things, there are obviously people out there that can do harm with that information. So it's that great challenge of having to treat that data really carefully and sensitively, because it can do great good, but in the wrong hands, it can do great harm.
Yeah, this is going to be so interesting to see how all this plays out, because we really want the good bit. We're not so interested in the bad bit, but the tension is here, these trade-offs that are going to have to be made. And I think at the end of the day, it's going to be a personal decision, for each user. But I mean, people can only make that kind of decision if they have the understanding, if they have the transparency around it. So you mentioned mobility before, which is a very topical thing to be talking about now. We're living through a pandemic. And I also mentioned GDPR. So this is the General Data Protection Regulations. Do you think these two things have kind of fast-tracked our understanding of data privacy, of location privacy?
Yeah, absolutely. I think GDPR was one of those changes to the way we looked at data. I mean, I think, if we talked earlier about me and my, opinion about the golden era of the early 2000s and that world. I think back in the 2000s, it was all about innovate. We've got this cool new tech and tools. Let's just push this as far as we possibly can go. Whereas I think we've reached this kind of really interesting space now where, oh my gosh, we can do pretty much whatever we want. This technology now is just so powerful that we can't even imagine the next thing that we're going to be able to do. And because of that power that we've now got, there's also much greater chance that we can do harm. So you're watching, if you like, the reins being pulled a little bit and say, well, I know we can do that, but should we do that? And I think GDPR was that real first big change, if you like, in the European space at least, that sort of said, look, you can't just do whatever you want, really, with data. There are really important reasons why this is personal and why people should have control of this. I think it was also a bit of a first stage as well of this concept of it being a barter arrangement, that this information is valuable to an individual, and that needs to be recognised. So I think it's definitely part of the process. I think GDPR has got really great points. I think its implementation has some challenges in how it's been implemented around the place. And I think, again, that comes down to communication and people's understanding of the regulations when you do these sorts of things. But I do think it's had a very good positive influence in the privacy space.
I wonder too if this is just the first iteration of these kinds of legislations. And I wonder if, the first time you go in with a broadsword, you make sweeping changes, and next time you go in with a scalpel and look at things and go, oh, what went good, what went bad next time, and the next iteration is better, and the one after that is even better than the first couple, and on and on and on, and things get better as we go. We talked about transparency a lot, really massive topic in itself. I am constantly amazed at how not very transparent geospatial people are. And I feel like because we work in a very technical space that we're almost afraid of making mistakes, we're almost afraid of documenting it, and we're definitely, at least in my opinion, afraid of showing it to the world, in case somebody else points out a mistake that we've made. What do you think needs to happen in terms of changing that mindset, that culture?
Well, I think we're in the first stages of doing that. It is such a true thing. And I think, yes, we are, I think, poor at that in the geospatial space. I think we're poor in the technology sector. I think that if you look at the growth of the technology sector as overall, it's, been so much about the shiny, doing amazing things. And I think the few times that someone or an organization gets caught out for doing something bad, they're vilified so strongly in a media context, and the information gets shared so widely that there is a really great fear of doing something wrong and being caught out for that. So I think there is a definite culture change that needs to happen here. There needs to be an acceptance. And I think, I don't think any geospatial practitioner would disagree with the fact that no project is perfect. In every single time you build a map or you look at a service that's going to use location data throughout it, there will be a trade-off because the data wasn't quite what you needed because you couldn't get quite enough of it, but you're still going to use it for the process anyway. Or, through the very best of intentions, you were planning to do a service that was crowdsourcing flood data information for, the right reasons of understanding the impact of that. But actually in the process of doing that, you can sometimes even cause a political situation because suddenly the reason for where the flooding is really bad is exposed. And suddenly that creates a political tension, perhaps between one part of society and another part of society that you simply never expected to occur. So I think the really important thing that we need to do, though, is start talking about particularly those times when it goes wrong. So for example, the Strava example of, the exposure of where there were military bases because all of their soldiers were doing their runs and so forth and tracking them on Strava. How do we learn from that? How do we build systems in the future that are not going to cause that sort of exposure in the public space if they're not supposed to? So I think part of that culture change is getting better at doing the sharing in there and getting better at saying, well, I made this decision, so going back to that transparency register, I made this decision in the middle of the project. To the best of my knowledge, with the best of the information that I had at the time, I had no idea that it could cause this harm later on. But I've now backtracked and worked out why that happened. You can learn from that. And I think that's the sort of culture change that we're trying to cause by raising this discussion around the ethics and the issues related to location privacy.
Are you hopeful when you think about where this is going? When you look out into the future now, do you think, okay, we're heading in the right direction? Are we on the right path, or is it just completely hopeless? It's too big of a task.
No, I am hopeful. I think, there's lots of examples around the world where the practices of governments and large organizations are being questioned, and not necessarily because they are actually, we know that they're doing something wrong, but because we don't know enough information about what they're doing in order to sort of trust the processes that are there. So I think the more we question, the more we have hearings about antitrust, the more we have, when a government says it's going to do a location tracing app and all of the media gets up and says, well, that's fine, but what are you doing with the data? How are you protecting our privacy? That gives me hope because people are questioning. They're not saying they won't use it. They're just saying, tell me more information so that I can make an educated decision about this.
Would you mind diving into some of those examples where you've seen, like concrete examples where you've seen the media say, hey, what about this thing here? And then you've seen a positive reaction from whatever organization it was on the other side?
Well, actually, I think that, if you look at the most recent one around the contact tracing apps, and you look at the response of organizations like Apple and Google, the biggest mobile phone OS organizers in the world, they, when questioned about their practices, got really open about what they thought was a good solution that would protect privacy and still help the solution. And there was a lot of questioning about that to start with and a lot of concern. But I think the outcome in the end meant that the organizations were really careful. They really thought about the solution and they really thought about what they were going to do and responded to those concerns and sort of shared the information that was out there for everybody. So to me, I thought that dialogue was actually quite healthy around the world between those organizations and I think the general public that were using their operating systems.
Yeah, I think that those are absolutely brilliant examples and obviously very, very topical right now. Hey, I think we should probably round off the conversation here. But before we do that, I've realized that I haven't done a really great job of introducing some of the work that you're currently doing. So we've mentioned the Benchmark project a few times now in the conversation. Could you just put a few more words around the Benchmark project for us?
Sure. So Benchmark Initiative is primarily a thought leadership and entrepreneur program that seeks to explore all of these ethical challenges of using location data. So over the course of the year, we've looked at things like the ethics of location data in agriculture. We've looked at the ethics of location data in tracing apps. We've looked at the ethics of location data in waste management. So throughout that, we've also had 4 entrepreneurs working with us too, some looking at different techniques, one now available around mobility data. So if you're someone who works in the mobility space, have a look at the Projects by If work on our Benchmark Initiative website. There's an open source tool for privacy techniques in there that you can use. But our other entrepreneurs are looking at things like how to educate people about the location data that's collected by their mobile phone and what they can do with it. Some are looking at development data and how we can improve, I guess, the processes for decision makers to understand where data is sourced from and how ethically appropriate it is for them to use for their decision-making processes within there too. Benchmark, I should say, is not alone either. So we're funded by the Omidyar Network and we work a lot in partnership with the Ethical Geo program over in the United States, particularly around what is called the Locust Charter. So one of those areas of guidance that we saw really early on was a need for the geospatial community to have a set of principles, if you like, to act as guides within this ethical new world that we need to work in. So the Locust Charter in draft form is up on our website now. There's a new version of that should be up very shortly. So probably by the time this podcast is out, I think the new version will be up there for everyone to have a look at. So we're really keen to see what the global geospatial community thinks of the principles that we put forward, and we're really keen to work with everybody to shape them so that there's something I think that we can all own and all work towards as a goal.
Thank you so much for sharing a little bit more information about that and letting people know where they can go to find out more. But where can people go now to find out more about you, if they want to connect with you, if they want to continue the conversation with you? What should these people do?
Probably the easiest way to find me is jump on LinkedIn, Denise McKenzie. If you're a Twitter user, feel free to get in touch with me. I'm at Spatial Red, all one word. And obviously, if you look up for the Association for Geographic Information here in the UK, there's an email address there and that would get through to me as well. So all really good ways of getting hold of me.
Hey, Denise, thank you so much for showing up with your delightful Australian accent and teaching us all a little bit more about the importance of location privacy. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
No worries, Daniel. Really pleased to be here today.
I really hope you enjoyed that conversation with Denise. During this conversation and throughout previous conversations with Denise, it became very clear to me that there's a real tension here. So on one side, we have the promise of personalization, of being seen and understood. If we share our data about how we interact with the world, then that data can be used to make things better. On the other side, we run the risk of being exposed, of being manipulated and being treated like a product instead of the consumer. So in terms of data privacy, I think location plays a massive role. And I think we, the geospatial community, we play a massive role in this conversation as well. So I'm not expecting you to have all the answers to this, but I would love it if you would make the effort to go out and educate yourself a little bit more around location privacy. And I really hope that this podcast episode has sort of set you on the right track. I would encourage you to reach out to Denise at the Benchmark Initiative if you're interested in carrying on the conversation. They're doing a lot of really great work out over there, and I know that they're coming up with some good resources for people to use. So please reach out to Denise if you're interested, and please continue to educate yourself around location privacy. Thanks again to today's sponsor, landgrid.com. This is your go-to resource for all things parcel data. So this is property boundary data for the US. It's land use data for the US. They have a lot of different ways you can get access to this data. So if this is something you need, if this is the resource that you've been looking for, go to landgrid.com, and I'm pretty confident that you'll find what you're looking for. And that's it for another episode of the Mapscaping Podcast. My name is Daniel. It's been a pleasure being your host again this week. Thank you so much to the people that are taking the time to share this podcast with a friend. It's much appreciated. It's helping grow the community, and it's really exciting to see. So thank you. You're more than welcome to reach out to me, as always, on social media or via our website, mapscaping.com. I would love to hear from you. Thanks again for taking the time to listen. I'll see you next week. Bye.